And last but not least, we've got our Mantus M1 25-pound anchor. They packaged this thing extremely well. Let me see if I can flip it over. It's got plywood on the bottom, since it's a heavy anchor and lots of moving parts. I'm assuming they reinforced it so that nothing pops out during shipping. So let's see what everything looks like. Everything is packaged pretty well. We've got some color instructions. That's pretty nice. Everybody prints black and white instructions these days to save a few bucks. Having a nice thick piece with color instructions so that you can even put it into the folder for your boat documentation. I keep a folder with all the instructions for everything. Radios, accessories, all of that stuff. It'll be nice to be able to keep this as well. You've got your QR code with card to register your product. And let's see, what is this guy? Some kind of a qualification certificate. All right, we got a few different pieces. We've got the hoop that goes over the top, I guess the anti-roll bar or the rollover bar. I'm not sure exactly what you would call that. Helps the anchor roll back over. We've got the main section of the anchor, very thick, much thicker than I expected, to be honest. It's a 25-pound anchor. I figured it'd be a lot thinner than this. I'm gonna weigh this whole thing after it's assembled. I bet you this weighs more than 25 pounds. I hope it does, but if it doesn't, great. It's still very thick and heavy duty, and very thick cast steel shaft. It's a good shape, as you can see. It's got the angle on the end, plenty of length on the shaft to go up the bow roller and get close to your windlass, so that even if you have a really long bow or a long bow roller, you've got plenty of length there to make sure that everything's able to get up and tie up securely before you start moving around with your boat. And then as you can see, there's 4 holes, 1, 2, 3, 4 at the base of the shaft, and that's how that's going to attach to our actual anchor plate right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then finally you're going to have the hoop here with the 2 ends that attaches here and here. So let's get everything apart and start assembling. You know what I love more than a really good product that's well designed, that I'm expecting to work well, even when taking it out of the box? What I love more than that is a company that takes pride in their well-designed product. Like the fact that they've got details like a plaque on here, the model, the website right there on the anchor. You don't get companies putting their phone numbers and their websites on their products unless they believe in them and they want you to contact them if something goes wrong. Because most of this stuff you'll put on your boat, you'll forget who you even bought it from in a year or two, and you'll probably replace it when you start having issues with it. The fact that these guys have their logo imprinted everywhere, they've got their labels on there, really shows you that they're proud of what they've built and they stand behind it. I love that. You don't see that from everybody. Here are the bolts that come with the anchor kit. You can see these 4 here are labeled shank flute bolts. Pretty obvious where they go. And these 2 here are labeled roll bar bolts. Looks like pretty nice galvanized hardware for all of the bolts. They're all pretty heavy duty, look like hardened steel. And you also have a little packet of grease. You probably want to put this onto the threads. Since these are galvanized bolts, they tend to be a little bit grabby when you're tightening things up. So you want to be able to lubricate the threads a little bit so that you can get the correct amount of torque on everything. So let's go ahead and get started assembling this guy. So here's the 4 bolts, nuts, and lock washers that are for the shank to flute connection. This is the shank here, and this is the flute. And the direction that this goes is like so. So the point of the shank that goes to your rope and chain is facing the same direction as the point of the fluke. And the backside flat here is pointing the same direction as the backside of the flank. the 4 holes that you'll be working with are these 2 up here in the front, which go in there, and then these 2 in the back, which go right there. No, you will not be using that hole in the back there. So let's see how we're gonna get these lined up. I'm gonna get these up from the bottom, and so the way I'm gonna install the bolts, the direction at least, you can put them up from the bottom to come up through here and up through the holes in the shank, or you can put them down through the top to go down to the bottom to where the nut is at the bottom. Either way you go, you want to make sure that the washer is on the end that is by the head of your bolt, and then either way you go, you want to make sure that the washer is on the end that is at the head of the nut, and then your bolt will be on the other end without the lock washer. So the lock washer is going to be against the nut, whichever end of the material that ends up on. What I'm going to do is put the bolt in from the bottom of the fluke, so it'll be sticking out of here upwards, and it'll come up through here, and then I'll put the lock washer on top of the shank there, and then finally the nut. Reason I'm going to be coming up from the bottom is so I have as little material as possible when it comes to the hardware sticking out of the bottom. That way it's not going to grab or snag on anything. If I come in through the top and go out through the bottom, there will be a little bit of threads. Some of the threads of the bolt will be sticking past the nut. I'll have more material of the hardware sticking out through the bottom of the anchor. So we're going to come up from the bottom. The shank's going to go over the top, then the lock washer on top of there, and then finally the nut. Next, we're going to put a little bit of grease on the threads. Get yourself some paper towels. Grease is really gross to deal with. It gets on everything, but it wipes right off. There's all 4 bolts. You can see I've got some grease on all the threads. All I did was poke a hole. They include 3 grease packets. If your anchor does not come with grease packets, if you got an anchor from someone else other than Mantus, you want to make sure to grease the bolts before putting them in the threads. And you can use automotive grease or whatever you have in a tube that you use on your boat. All I did was poke a hole into one of the grease packets. They're sealed up pretty good. So poked a hole in one of them, stuck the end with the threads of each of the bolts into the hole, spun it around a little bit, pulled it out, and we've got grease on our threads. So let's get the first one started and see how this thing starts to look once assembled. All right, we've got things loosely assembled, still not tight or torqued down. I don't like tightening anything until everything's on there. Next thing I want to do is get the roll bar bolted down. The roll bar has 4 holes on the bottom, as you can see, and then it also has some holes on the side here for drainage. And if you notice, you've got 4 holes as well there. The outside holes are not for your bolts. They're so that the drain holes here have somewhere to drain out of. And the inside holes are where your bolts are going to go, and they're going to go through the flange on the roll bar. At first glance, it looks like the flanges are fairly symmetrical, but you'll see that it only goes one direction. So if you try to put the roll bar on this direction, where it's tilted towards the shank, you'll notice that if you line up one bolt hole, the other bolt hole does not really line up, and then the drain holes are kind of off as well. So if you pay attention, it'll become pretty obvious that the roll bar goes this direction, where it's pointed away from the shank. And once you get it on this direction, you'll notice that the flanges line up perfectly, the drain holes line up perfectly, same on this side, everything lines up exactly where it should. So let's get the bolts, lock washers, and nuts greased up for these 2 flanges as well and get them started. Loosely assembled. This is loose, but all the threads are started. As you can see, you've got the 4 nuts, bolts, and lock washers that hold the shank to the fluke right there. And then you've got the 2 bolts, nuts, and lock washers that hold the roll bar to the fluke. And then the drain holes for the roll bar underneath line up perfectly on both sides. All the flanges line up. I've got all of the nuts and the threads for the bolts facing upwards so that I have as little material as possible protruding from the bottom. You can put them in the other way as well. Lots of people do. If you like the look of them pointing the other direction, by all means, go for it. Put it in the other direction. I think as far as functionality, in my personal opinion, this works better or should work better, especially if you're on a rocky bottom, something that's not mud or sand. So I'm gonna go ahead and tighten all these up and get everything torqued down, and then we should be able to use our anchor. Got it fully assembled. This thing looks pretty impressive. I'm really excited to get it on the boat, give it a shot in the different areas of the lake with the mud bottoms, the rock bottoms, gravel bottoms, grassy bottoms, see how it does and if it lives up to the hype. Based on what I've seen on a couple friends' boats with the Mantus Anchor, and then all of the different fluke anchor, the digger, the Danforth, the plow style anchors that we've had or friends have had over the years, I've seen pretty good results from friends that have had this Mantus anchor. There's also the M2 version of the Mantus, and it's the one, if you look it on their website, it has the more curved shank, and it's also shorter. And it doesn't have the roll bar there for different style of bow pulpits, depending on how your bow roller and everything is set up in the front. So I'm really excited to see how this works. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and see you next time.